Good morning, and thank you for joining our webinar around supply chain best practices. I'm Dee Bowers, and I'll be your moderator. So before we jump in, I'm going to just briefly go over how to use the webinar pane. On the right side of your monitor, you should see an orange arrow. If you click that arrow, you'll be able to toggle the webinar pane between the open and closed position. You should also see a small chat window. Feel free to enter your questions in throughout the presentation. We'll answer them at the end of the webinar during our Q&A session as time allows. So now's a good time to also double check your audio settings. If you're calling in on your telephone, please make sure you've chosen the Use Telephone option. Alternatively, if you're on your computer, please make sure you've selected the Use Mic and Speakers option. I also want to note that this webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sending out a link to the recording and slide deck within 48 hours. With that, I'd like to go ahead and jump over to our presenters. First, we have Jeff Russell, Director of Industry at Armanino. Jeff brings over 10 years of experience working with AX and has an extensive supply chain management background. Also leads our teams in developing high-tech and life science industry solutions. I'm also pleased to introduce John Van Meter, Manager of our Dynamics practice. John brings over 12 years of experience working with clients on Dynamics projects with a heavy focus on supply chain and distribution industries. He's helped clients define requirements, assess goals, and lay out comprehensive technology strategies. So it's great to have you guys both here, and with that I'm going to turn the presentation over to John.
All right, thanks Dee. So great, what we're going to do today is we're going to cover talking about the outsourced supply chain. So Jeff's going to start off telling us a little bit about the challenges of managing an outsourced supply chain and how we really address the challenges of the black box. And we'll talk a little bit about compliance and traceability and how you can move towards more of a proactive versus a reactive planning model. And then also just how do you identify and eliminate some of your supply chain obstructions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Thanks, John. So what you're seeing on the screen now is really an illustration of the traditional manufacturing supply chain model where visibility is as easy as just going down to the floor, taking a look at things, more control over planning, managing material safety stocks, oversight of actual inventories, production issues, and even all the way through to carrier pickups for finished goods shipments going out the door. But that model is really contrasted to what we think of in the outsourced supply chain as the black box. So regardless of industry, most companies leveraging outsourcing refer to a desire for it to be a black box. And materials in that environment are basically provided to a subcontractor, the magic is happening, and then out comes the produced parts. But the black box is really, it's representative of a utopian world where outsourced manufacturing is executed flawlessly, it's on time, and there's no need for traceability or genealogy after shipment. Most really can't achieve this, right? Most manufacturing companies, that's just not a reality. So instead, companies still aspire to have the quality and stability in their outsourced operations such that they could treat them like a black box. But even with those quality suppliers involved, you really want high levels of visibility and quality performance monitors. And there are many other business justifications behind having access to what is happening in that black box. So let's take a look at some of those drivers. Next slide, please. Thanks, John. So a big driver really is understanding what's happening. So you want to monitor supplier performance and make assessments as to what level of performance are they executing to, where do you need to work on addressing and improving the business with those subcontractors. And also if your business is scaling, the level of activity may make monitoring that type of progress or performance really just completely infeasible on a manual basis. You also see situations where manual transactions in lieu of integration require more people, and they can be more prone to errors, which actually costs you and your customers ultimately more time and money. So increasing efficiencies, reducing costs, things like that that can benefit both your company and the customer, those are definitely added benefits to working on an integrated model. There's also regulations and customer demands in situations that necessitate greater levels of traceability. Lot level control, serial level control. You have industries like the medical device industry where cradle to grave visibility is absolutely critical, especially even at a serial level. And that level of traceability actually increases the volume of transactions in your MRP and in your ERP, excuse me. And then also there's situations where compliance, includes responsiveness requirements around, being able to respond to a query within 24 hours, else you're potentially going to get levied with a fine. So there's lots of different drivers there. Overall, improved communication is a big one. Your industry may be fraught with rapid changes in the market and demands, et cetera, and the ability to integrate your supply chain will streamline your communication processes and really just create a win-win situation across the board. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to John, let John kind of walk through an outsourced supply chain example.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So, what I wanted to do is kind of use an example of an outsourced manufacturer, and we're going to take the example of a fabless semiconductor manufacturer. And in this model, the raw materials are purchased from a raw material supplier called a wafer fab, and those materials are then shipped off to a contract manufacturer. And at that contract manufacturer, there's some production that goes on and some detailed variability that can happen within that goods stayed into the distributor or another 3PL, so another third party. And this is a simplified version. Many times there's multiple wafer fabs that might be used, multiple subcontractors, even series of subcontractors that might be used to support the manufacturing process, and of course multiple distributors as well. But to give you an idea, a lot of this is happening, all of it's happening outside of your four walls. So for you to get the level of visibility that Jeff was talking about and all that traceability, you really need to simulate a lot of that manufacturing tracking in your ERP system. So one other thing I wanted to address was when we talk about the long-term planning or the planning accuracy, it's just good to keep in perspective what that really means. So from a wafer fab perspective, that purchase to receipt process, maybe 8 to 12 weeks long. It's just a very complex manufacturing process with hundreds of steps that are involved to take a raw wafer and make it prepared and processed to be shipped off to the subcontractor. And so once that product is then received by the subcontractor, it can take another 1 to 4 weeks to do the assembly of the goods before they move off to the distributor. So what that means is we really have to, from a supply chain perspective, get an understanding of what that forecasted demand is going to be from our customers. And we also receive our demand from our 3PL or distributors, and so that hard sales order based demand is what we call our backlog of stuff that's waiting to be shipped. So when we do issue our purchase orders out to our fab and we get a series of scheduled commitments back from them over time, if they give us a periodic update, we're able to take that information in and get a closer match of balancing what that supply profile is going to look like and against our demand. And as any variations come up, we can make adjustments and be a little bit more proactive in case we do have a a bluebird demand, a huge order that's coming in, or our product just got designed into the new iPhone model, something like that. And then once that product does get shipped off, our raw materials get shipped off from our wafer fab, we need to get a ship notification so we know that that product is going to be expected to be received by our contract manufacturer or subcon. That kind of leads us into the whole logistics tracking, because we're transferring materials from one site to the next, right? So we may purchase the raw materials from one of our suppliers, the wafer fab, and then it may land at one of our subcontractors, but we're not physically touching or receiving any of that material. So, but we do need to track, the custody of that product, because it's something that we've purchased, we own it, and we need to understand what our liability is in terms of the inventory as it goes from one site to the next and where that's located. So, as the brand owner, the designer of these products, we're ultimately responsible for the traceability of these goods. And so we need to have this transaction level detail that says, what's being shipped, is it in transit, has it been received yet, has it been lost in transit, is it delayed? Those types of details help us in the overall planning of our ability to reach the next step in the production cycle, which helps us to communicate to our subcontractors the type of capacity they need to allocate to us. And then it also flows down to how we're able to, based on those lead times, meet the backlog that we have. So when we get down into that subcontractor level detail, and again, I mentioned you may have one subcontractor or back-to-back subcontractors. The idea here is that there's a lot of variability that can happen just within a single subcontractor. So a single raw material or a single wafer can actually be produced into multiple finished goods. It's what we call a reverse bill of material. So that single wafer has a series of die on it, and that die can be changed by the way it's incorporated into a package, into a different finished good. And so based on our short-term planning, we know what our demand is looking like, and we can tell our subcontractor how to take that wafer and to assemble it and build it out into the package that's going to be desired by our customer. So to be able to track how that material gets transformed at the subcontractor, we need to first understand what our material is, and then we need to direct them to start a certain lot of material. It's material that we own. We want them to use it in a single production, and that way we can trace the origination of the lot from the wafer all the way through their production cycle onto the finished goods. And within that process, we're paying for a service, right? It's our material. We aren't paying, for a bunch of products or just a finished good. We're paying for a service. And that service comes in the form of a bunch of what we'll call a service purchase order. We're asking them to do assembly or test or packaging. And those individual services that they're performing are what we call a pay point. So we pay based on all the products that are assembled, and all the products that are tested. But if they're, in the case that an assembled product gets broken in process, well, we're not going to pay for the broken one. So it's only the good products that come out of an assembly step, but all products that go into a test step. So with that, we accrue a lot of costs, and those costs get captured into our overall production flow. But midstream, we may say, hey, we had sent you down this path to package a product a certain way. We actually need to change that package. It's not going to be a tape and reel. Maybe it's going to be put into a tray, or something as simple as that. We need to direct the process midstream to be changed. So just having the communication back and forth with the subcontractor is one of those strategic things that allows us to not only hit the traceability requirements, but also really helps us control the supply chain, both from a lead time perspective as well as the variability that comes with that midstream changes. So kind of following it all the way through the process, we need to know the raw materials, the WIP, and the finished goods. And as I mentioned, you have your series of steps, your operations that go on. We're really capturing these at a summary level. The best practice is not to hit the 20 or so steps because we don't want to make the data requirements so heavy that it is cost prohibitive or it's burdensome to capture every operational step. But really those pay points, so the initial sort, assembly, test. Whatever we're paying for in terms of a service, we need to set those up as operations. And the other key aspect of this model in particular is that we're planning to yields. So we know that at a certain step there may be a yield, meaning that there's going to be less material that's going to go into the next operation. And if we have another yield, then there's going to be even less, as cumulative yield that goes through the operation. And so we anticipate that. We plan for it, and we set up our standard costs and everything associated with that. So we know from a planning perspective, what we're estimating to start and what we're estimating to get out. And that really helps us to understand what that net cumulative yield is going to be from a planning, availability of inventory to ship to our, customers at the end of the day. And the key there is if we did have a big yield hit, we would know that when that yield hit occurs, that we're going to expect fewer in and ultimately fewer out of the next step. And again, it allows us to plan with more precision. So, if one of the roadblocks was we had a lower than expected yield, being able to see that as a transactional type of a WIP adjustment, then we know immediately that we need to issue more lot starts to be able to fulfill the demand that's out there in our backlog. So I'll turn it over to Jeff with some of the keys to making that successful.
Thanks, John. So like any project or any undertaking, any initiative, it's important to keep in mind what are the make or break elements for success. And so looking at trying to outsource and integrate your outsourced supply chain, there's a few key things I really want to highlight here, and it really starts with relationships. Being successful in automating and integrating with an outsourced supply chain is completely predicated on this. I can't tell you enough. I mean, working with 30 or more companies doing these types of integrations over the last 15 years, the biggest predicated item for success has really been on the quality relationships that the manufacturer has with their supply chain resources. So, at the end of the day, you're going to be asking of your suppliers to do a lot. You're going to be looking for getting better data, getting data in a more timely manner, working to get the data in the format that you need, things of that nature. And so you're going to be asking and tasking them with a lot of responsibilities. And so the better that your relationships are with your supply chain partners, the more successful you're going to be. Additionally, data policies are a key area. I mean, you need to set yourself up for scalability and long-term use. You need to reinforce across the organization the need for clean data. And you need to work towards trying to get to a place where you can integrate with transactional data rather than snapshots. I know John is going to touch on this a little bit. And then I think another really key element is right-sizing the approach. So I think of this as a crawl, walk, run concept. So transaction volumes for each of your trading partners should really be a key driver to determine whether or not or how you're going to communicate and then ultimately automate transactions with that trading partner. So we've got a few examples up here. I mean, the first, fax and email, of course, is basically a non-integrated model. So when you're working with suppliers where you're only doing a handful of transactions a month or a year, it's probably not a great candidate from a from an efficiency standpoint to try to integrate with that supplier. Portals is another area where you can kind of step into beginning to enhance and improve the level of communication. But portals in themselves aren't necessarily what we think of as an integration. So with the portal, you can give the supplier access to the system to see the information, the relevant orders that they need, and likewise they can report in information there that you have visibility to receive as well. But when we think about integrating, we really think of a B2B model, and there's a couple aspects of that. You can do it through batching, or you can do it on a real-time transaction-by-transaction basis. And so again, this level of transaction volume is really going to be the driver to which model is most appropriate. So it's going to be more expensive and more challenging as an undertaking to go to a real-time model than it is to embrace a batch process. So just things that you need to keep in mind. I mean, at the end of the day, automation is not the right answer for everything, so you just need to make sure you can justify it with the relevant scale. Closely related to that, though, is being proactive. So, you got to keep planning ahead. You got to be thinking about what's ahead in the curve, anticipating your business needs and where the business is going, and then ultimately working on basically developing a deeper integration with your supply chain partners. So that can include, more frequent transactions. It can include more complexity in terms of the number of operations that you've integrated to, and it could even include additional trading partners. So ultimately, you just want to be able to lay out a roadmap, plan ahead, and identify what's important to the business in 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, and beyond, and have a right approach for going about that. And then the last point here really is to drive this all home, bring in that ROI on what you've done with a supply chain integration. So maximizing the benefits through MRP. And by this, what we really mean is leveraging your ERP capabilities around master scheduling, master planning, to give yourselves the greatest amount of agility to react to changes in the supply chain, unanticipated demand, any types of issues. It could be testing equipment going down. It could be something, quality issues in the lab, whatever it might be. Your responsiveness to your supply chain is really going to be maximized by actually leveraging MRP in your ERP solution. So with that said, I'm going to turn it back over to John and talk to you a little bit about some best practices around integration.
Great. So yeah, as Jeff and I, both alluded to here, I mean, there's two ways to kind of look at this. I mean, when you start off, a lot of companies will ask their supply chain partners to provide just a snapshot of their WIP. Where are things at in the line? And that's marginally effective. I mean, you could kind of deduce based on where things are at, where they may end up after a period of time, but it doesn't really give you a whole lot of visibility into starts and stops or the lead times associated with it. So because of that, we've really helped guide a lot of companies down the path of transactional WIP, and transactional WIP is really that purchase receipt, start, stop, lead time, based on operations. So how long does it typically take? How many units are going through? Is it a one-day turn? Is it a is it a 2-week turn? So being able to have more of that transactional WIP gives us the greatest level of traceability, both from a planning as well as a compliance perspective throughout the entire line. So that's really the best way to go, is to first off have a system that's able to support it, and two, design your supply chain around it. So making sure you have partners that understand it, that are capable of supporting you in that model, and coordinate with them so that it all works out, so that you're both able to get the level of control and visibility that you need. The next aspect that is another important part to look at is the whole synchronization of inventory and financials in your supply chain. So many times when companies start off, they're using a lower end financial package that doesn't really do the level of planning required from an inventory perspective, or the traceability required from a production process when you're externally managing it. So being able to, one, take the transactional WIP, and two, be able to synchronize your supply chain across both the financials and inventory does a lot for making it easier to close your inventory at month end, and closing your books and reconciling what your standard costs were versus your variances associated with the inventory. So just a huge benefit when you have the right systems in place. And the other aspect we see is visibility into errors and yield loss. So this has a lot of implications. I mean, one, from costing, knowing what your standard error codes are, and what you're actually trending to from a deviation perspective. The other aspect is, when you use a snapshot-based WIP, you only know the amount that's in a given operation. You really don't know how you arrive there. So you don't know if it was the first operation where items shook out at, or if it was the third operation where items shook out at. And so when you have that visibility into good and error quantity and yield loss throughout the production cycle, then your quality team has a lot more visibility into what's occurring from an engineering perspective. And it also gives you the ability to plan what that end inventory is going to come out. We talked about cumulative yields and operation-based yields. Well, when you understand how much is anticipated to go into one process and how much is anticipated to come out the other, that gives you greater visibility into what you can expect out, and certainly match your available supply toward that end demand. The fourth here is the full lot lineage and traceability. So what that means is, as that brand owner, we talked about you're purchasing raw materials from one supplier. In this case, it's a wafer, and you need to know from a lot perspective, and many times even a serial perspective, how those are going to be used by your subcontractor in the production cycle. And then if it goes out to the next subcontractor and the next subcontractor and on to a 3PL or distributor, you need to be able to trace everything from the country of origin, the people who worked on it, and give that level of detail to your end customer, because many of the customers that are out there, especially Tier 1 type customers, will qualify not just an end product, but the end product that's been manufactured at a given plant or sourced from a certain vendor of raw materials. So they'll qualify it all the way back. And there's a lot of heat around this in the industry today because of what came out of the Dodd-Frank Act in terms of conflict minerals, of being able to have that degree of vendor qualification all the way through the chain. So having a system that, from a fabless semiconductor manufacturer, or really a contract manufacturer, or somebody who uses contract manufacturing, being able to provide that level of comfort and auditability throughout the supply chain is something that is a key requirement today. And then, we hit on this in many ways already, the planning accuracy. So knowing what your forecast is, knowing what your demand is, and being able to plan accordingly and react proactively to any of the roadblocks that may come up throughout the process, whether it's greater than expected yields, or it's as Jeff mentioned, a line goes down, or quality issues at a certain plant, flooding, whatever it is. We need to be able to be flexible to make sure that when we know that there's going to be planning implications, one, we have an accurate picture of what it is, and two, we're able to react. So during this webinar, some of the things that we covered were just how complex some of these supply chain requirements can be, and very data intensive. So it's just incredibly important and paramount that the supply chain systems that you have in place are able to support the requirements that your industry has. So being able to address that compliance and traceability, that's huge. And then to be able to make all of that come together, it really takes integrations and partner alignment. So if you think of a super high volume type of an organization that is doing lot level and serial level traceability, then integrations are the only way to go. As you get into the lower volume, you can have a little bit more flexibility, but still the need for the systems doesn't go away. But just from an overall partner alignment perspective, we talked about how important the collaboration and communication with your partners is, because really it is a partnership when you're working with a contract manufacturer, and it takes a lot of mutual work to make sure that you guys are on the same page. But the end game for everybody is that it does significantly improve the accuracy and timeliness, and allows both you and your partners to scale operations. So with that, we wanted to open it up to any questions that have come in. And it looks like we have a couple already. So let's see. The first one is, we're just starting our implementation of Dynamics AX and wanted to understand when the best timing is to bring up integrations with our partners. What do you suggest? So Jeff, I'll let you take that one.
All right, thanks, John. Yeah, so great question. I think this one really goes back to what we talked about around keys to success. So be proactive. I mean, it's going to take time. Working on integrating with your suppliers is going to be something that's important, and you may already have some integrations today built around your legacy ERP system. But working on the implementation of AX, you want to be as responsive and proactive as possible with your suppliers. Something to think about is that you're probably working with some manufacturers, and I'm guessing that you're outsourcing, or many companies outsource due to leverage, economies of scale that some of the larger contract manufacturers can achieve. But as a result of that, your contact with that supplier, or that partner, might not be the only contact of that nature. They may be working, as an organization, that manufacturer may be working with other companies in a similar position. And so it's good to kind of give them some time to internalize and ask around, hey, who else are we working with today that's also using Dynamics AX, and we're integrated with them, so that they can basically leverage what they've already done as well, and maybe offer some suggestions so that you guys aren't completely reinventing the wheel. But again, just in general, I think this is the time. If you've begun your implementation, you definitely want to kind of lay out the roadmap for your testing cycles and your go live deployment with those guys. So great question.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. And it looks like we have another question in here too. It comes from somebody. Let's see. So I've tried to integrate with my overseas subcons in the past and had issues with data quality. How are your customers dealing with those challenges?
All right, that's another good question, and not a rare one either. There's a lot of different things you can do. I think something that I've seen that tends to be very effective, if it's something that you can, and something that you're able to take a look into, is actually bringing some on-site bodies. So a lot of the subcontractors, especially the larger ones, in Asia specifically, but really throughout the world, often allow some of their key customers to bring in a resource that works directly for that customer to actually kind of monitor progress and see kind of what's happening, to kind of be boots on the ground of what's going on in that black box out there. So that's a area that can be really helpful, because it's more effective to be able to engage in some face-to-face communication when you're trying to undertake the onset of this type of integration. I think over time, it's certainly that's not a long-term need. I think that's something that you can investigate as kind of a short-term deal. And then ultimately, as the quality improves and the data is more in line with what you're expecting and what you need, that type of resource wouldn't necessarily be required. But good question as well.
All right, thanks, Jeff. And it looks like all the questions we have in the chat box there. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Dee.
Thanks so much, John. So that wraps up our Q&A session. If you have any other questions that you think of after our webinar, please feel free to reach out to John or Jeff directly at the information on the screen there. And then as you exit, there'll be a quick survey. If you could just take a moment and let us know how we're doing, we'd really appreciate that. So we thank you for your time, and we hope you have a great day. And again, we'll be sending out a recording of this webinar and presentation within 48 hours. Thanks so much.